Victor Caldwell paced the hallway of his mansion at 3 in the morning. Winter wind rattled the expensive windows. Each gust seemed to mock the fortune he'd spent on this house. On everything his money could buy. The bedroom door opened. Dr. Harrison emerged, shaking his head. His face carried the weariness of defeat. "The fever's not breaking, Mr. Caldwell," Harrison said quietly. "I've tried everything in my bag." Victor's jaw tightened. "Try harder. I'll pay double your usual fee." "Triple, it's not about money." The doctor's voice held gentle firmness. "Sometimes these things take their own time." Victor turned away, dismissing the sentiment. Time was another commodity he could purchase. He'd already sent telegrams to specialists in San Francisco and Denver. The best medical minds money could summon would arrive within days. Through the partially open door, he heard his son's voice, weak, delirious with fever. "Mama!" Thomas called. "Mama, where are you?" Victor's hand froze on the door frame. Elizabeth had been gone 2 years. Consumption had taken her despite every treatment he'd funded, every specialist he'd hired, every experimental medicine he'd imported from Europe. He should go to Thomas, hold him, comfort him. His feet wouldn't move. "I recommend hiring nursing care," Dr. Harrison said behind him. "Round the clock, someone to sit with the boy, keep him comfortable. I've already arranged for specialists. Until they arrive, Mr. Caldwell, your son needs someone present." Victor nodded stiffly. Present. As if sitting beside a sickbed accomplished anything. He'd built an empire through action, through wielding his will and his wealth like tools. This helplessness felt foreign, intolerable. "Send word to anyone qualified," he said. "I'll pay whatever they ask." Dr. Harrison gathered his bag. "I'll make inquiries in town. Try to get some rest. Victor, you can't help the boy if you collapse from exhaustion." The door closed. Victor stood alone in the hallway. Lamplight flickered against walls lined with expensive paintings he'd purchased but never really looked at. His boots, finest leather, made no sound on the imported carpet. Inside Thomas's room, the boy tossed restlessly. The fever had him in its grip for 3 days now. Every treatment had failed, every medicine, every prayer Victor had awkwardly attempted when no one was watching. He took one step toward the doorway, then stopped. The gap between him and his son felt wider than any canyon. Money had built this mansion, furnished these rooms, hired the best doctors. But standing here in the cold pre-dawn darkness, Victor Caldwell felt powerless for the first time since he'd struck silver 15 years ago. The richest man in the territory, utterly helpless before a child's fever. He retreated to his study. At his desk, he composed more telegrams, offering extravagant fees, promising bonuses for quick arrival. The pen scratched across paper. Numbers and dollar signs, the language he understood. Outside, winter held the land in its frozen grip. Inside, a father stood on the wrong side of his son's door. Unable to cross the threshold that separated wealth from what truly mattered, morning light found Victor at his desk. He hadn't slept. The telegrams had been sent. Now came the waiting. A knock at the door pulled him from his papers. "Mr. Caldwell." His housekeeper's voice carried through the wood. "There's a woman here about the nursing position." Victor straightened his vest and emerged. In the foyer stood a woman in a worn dark dress, perhaps 32 years old. She carried a simple leather medical bag and met his eyes with quiet composure. "Claire Morrison," she said. "Dr. Harrison sent word you needed help." Victor gave her a cursory glance. Plain features. Calloused hands, widow's black, though the dress showed careful mending. She'd do until the real doctors arrived from the city. "My son is upstairs. Third door on the right." He gestured vaguely. "The specialists arrive by week's end. You'll assist them." "May I see him first? I just told you where he is." Impatience edged his voice. He had correspondence to manage. Mining reports to review. My housekeeper will show you to the room. Your wages will be generous." Claire Morrison didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, she studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not intimidation, not deference. Something else entirely. "I'd like to understand his condition before I begin," she said. "What treatments have been tried?" Victor rattled off the list. Every tonic, every powder, every poultice the doctors had prescribed. She listened without interrupting. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll go to him now." She climbed the stairs with unhurried steps. Victor watched her go, then returned to his study. Hired help. They did what they were told and collected their pay. Simple transaction. An hour passed. Then 2. Victor found excuses to walk past Thomas's door. Each time he heard Claire's voice inside. Soft. Steady. Speaking to Thomas as though the boy could hear and understand every word. The 3rd time he paused. He noticed something. The restless sounds from his son's room had quieted. Thomas's labored breathing seemed easier. He pushed the door open slightly. Claire sat beside the bed. She'd opened the window despite the winter cold. Fresh air moved through the room, displacing the stale sickness smell. She'd rearranged the pillows, adjusted the blankets, placed a cool cloth on Thomas's forehead. Thomas's eyes were closed. His breathing, while still troubled, had found a steadier rhythm. "What did you do?" Victor asked from the doorway. Claire looked up. Nothing the doctors hadn't already tried. Sometimes children respond to small comforts. Fresh air. Gentle touch, a calm voice. Superstitious nonsense. Perhaps. She turned back to Thomas, dipping the cloth in cool water. "But he's resting easier now." Victor wanted to argue, to assert that real medicine came from universities and laboratories, not from open windows and soft words. But he couldn't deny what he saw. His son, sleeping more peacefully than he had in days. "You'll stay through the night," he said, not a question, a command. "I'll pay you well." "I'll stay for Thomas," Claire corrected gently. "That's why I came." The distinction seemed meaningless to Victor. Everyone worked for money. Everyone had a price. He'd built his empire on that certainty. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Just a chair beside his bed. She asked for nothing else. No list of supplies, no discussion of terms. She simply sat with his son, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Victor retreated to his study, but he found himself standing in the hallway instead. Watching through the cracked doors, this strange woman sat vigil over his child. She'd been in his house less than 3 hours. Already something had shifted. Some small change he couldn't name. The specialists would arrive soon. They'd fix whatever this fever was. They'd justify every dollar he was spending. But tonight, Thomas slept, and a widow in a mended dress had accomplished what the finest physicians in the territory could not. Victor tried to work. Mining reports covered his desk, production numbers from his claims, profit calculations that would have consumed his attention any other day. Instead, he kept seeing Claire Morrison's face, the way she'd looked at him when she said, "I'll stay for Thomas." As if money wasn't the point. He pushed back from his desk and walked to Thomas's room. Claire was reading to the boy from a worn book. Thomas slept, but her voice continued. Soft stories about frontier adventures and cowboys and men who did right when doing right was hard. "He can't hear you," Victor said from the doorway. "Maybe not." Claire didn't look up. "But I like to think some part of him knows he's not alone." Victor had been alone at 12 when his parents died. No one read to him. No one sat beside him. He'd learned fast that survival meant working harder than anyone else, wanting less, needing no one. By 23, he'd struck silver. By 30, he owned half the profitable mines in the territory. He'd married Elizabeth because she was the one thing money couldn't buy, at least. Not directly. Love had seemed like weakness at first. Then it became the only soft place in his hard world. When she fell sick, he'd thrown everything at saving her. built a sanitarium addition to this very mansion, hired specialists from back east, imported medicines from Europe, spent a fortune. She died anyway. Her last words haunted him still. Give Thomas what I can't anymore. Give him you. Not your money. He'd promised, then immediately buried himself in work, expanding operations, acquiring new claims, building an empire for his son to inherit. Provision was love. That's what he'd learned as an orphaned boy working claims. Give them security, give them wealth. That was how a man showed he cared. Now this widow sat reading to his unconscious son, talking about presence and comfort and things Victor couldn't measure or purchase. The specialists arrive tomorrow, he said. They'll fix this. Claire finally looked up. Her eyes held no judgment, just a sadness that made him want to leave the room. I hope they can help, she said. But Victor, may I call you Victor? Your son needs more than fixing. He needs to get well. Yes, and then he needs his father. The words landed like an accusation. Victor stiffened. He has everything a boy could want. Education, opportunities, a future secured. He has your money. Claire's voice stayed gentle. Somehow that made it worse. But when was the last time you just sat with him? Victor had no answer. His promises to Elizabeth had died with her. Work had swallowed him. Grief had hollowed him. He'd become efficient at providing, terrible at being present. He stopped. Started again. I don't know how to be what he needs. The admission cost him. Victor Caldwell didn't admit weakness. Didn't ask for help. Didn't confess his failures to hired staff. But Claire Morrison wasn't looking at him like hired staff. She was looking at him like someone who understood loss, who recognized the walls people built to survive. You learn, she said simply, one day at a time, one moment at a time. She returned to her book. Victor stood in the doorway, unable to enter, unable to leave, below in his study. Mining reports waited. Telegrams needed answers. An empire required management. But here in this room, his son slept fitfully, and a widow who'd lost everything still knew how to give. Victor descended to his study. At his desk, he wrote out a bank draft. Doubled Claire's wages. Money always worked eventually. It had to, without that certainty. What did he have? He signed the draft and set it aside. Outside. Winter darkness fell early. Inside. The mansion's expensive heating struggled against the cold. Upstairs. A door had opened slightly. Victor didn't know it yet. But Claire Morrison had already crossed a threshold he couldn't, and whether he wanted to or not, he would have to follow. The specialists arrived on the evening train. 3 renowned physicians Victor had summoned with telegrams and extravagant promises. They examined Thomas with grave expressions and technical language that justified their fees. Dr. Winters from San Francisco studied the boy's eyes and pulse. Dr. Chen from Denver listened to his breathing through a wooden stethoscope. Dr. Phillips from Chicago took detailed notes and asked about every symptom. They conferred in hushed voices outside the room. Important men discussing important matters. Victor stood with them, finally feeling useful again. This was his world. Expertise purchased. Problems solved through proper channels and sufficient funds. We'll try a new treatment protocol. Dr. Winters announced quinine derivatives, silver nitrate solutions, a compound I've had success with in similar cases. Whatever it costs, Victor said. Considerable. I'm afraid these are rare medicines. Difficult to obtain. Send your bills to my office. Spare no expense. The doctors nodded approvingly. This they understood. A man willing to do whatever necessary. Money equaling commitment, equaling love. Claire assisted as they administered the treatments. She followed every instruction precisely. Measured dosages, monitored responses, asked intelligent questions that earned reluctant respect from the visiting physicians. For 3 days, the treatments continued. The medicines came in special packages marked with stamps from distant cities. Each dose cost more than most miners earned in a month. Thomas worsened. The fever climbed higher. His moments of lucidity grew rarer. The specialists added more compounds, adjusted protocols, imported additional supplies from their networks back east. Victor signed every invoice without looking. Numbers stopped mattering. Only results mattered. But results weren't coming. On the fourth morning, Dr. Winters suggested a sanitarium in California. Dry climate. Specialized facility. Round-the-clock expert care. "We could have him on a train this afternoon," the doctor said. "The journey is arduous, especially in winter. But the sanitarium has achieved remarkable outcomes." Victor was already calculating logistics, cost of travel, accommodation expenses, duration of treatment. The numbers climbed into thousands. He didn't hesitate. "Make the arrangements." "Papa." The weak voice came from the bedroom. Victor turned. Thomas was awake. Fever-bright eyes searched the room. "Papa, where's Claire?" The words hit Victor like a physical blow. His son was awake, conscious, and asking for the nurse instead of his father. "I'm here." "Thomas." Victor started toward the bed. Thomas turned his face away. "I want Claire." The rejection carved something out of Victor's chest. He stood frozen while Claire moved past him. She took Thomas's hand. The boy's grip tightened on her fingers. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're all right. You're safe." Thomas's eyes closed again, but his breathing calmed. His restless movements stilled. He held Claire's hand like it was the only solid thing in his fevered world. Dr. Winters cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps you should handle the travel arrangements while Miss Morrison manages the immediate care. Sometimes a patient's stress can transfer. Children are particularly sensitive." The words were carefully chosen. Professional. But Victor heard their true meaning. "Your presence agitates your son. Leave the nursing to hired help." Victor's voice came out harsh. "She's not a trained physician. You're the experts." "Indeed." Dr. Winters exchanged glances with his colleagues. But medical science works in concert with patient comfort. The boy clearly trusts Miss Morrison. We should utilize that trust while implementing proper treatment. Victor wanted to rage, to insist on his place beside his son, to demand recognition that he was the father, the one who'd provided everything, the one who'd summoned these experts at great expense. Instead, he turned and walked out, down the hallway, down the stairs, into his study where contracts and ledgers made sense. Through the floor above, he heard Claire's voice, singing, some old hymn about peace and rest and valleys of shadow. Her voice wasn't trained or beautiful, just steady, constant. Thomas's breathing audible through the ceiling, calming, responding to her presence in ways no expensive medicine had achieved. Victor stood at his window. Outside, winter held everything in its grip. Inside, the finest medical minds money could buy conferred over charts and compounds. And upstairs, a widow in a mended dress held his son's hand, gave him the one thing Victor's fortune couldn't purchase. She gave him peace. Victor couldn't sleep. 2 a.m. found him wandering his own house like a stranger. Everywhere he looked, he saw things his money had bought, nothing he actually needed. His feet carried him to Thomas's door. He meant to just pass by, check that the boy was resting. Instead, he stopped. Through the crack, he saw Claire. She'd fallen asleep in her chair, but her hand still held Thomas's, even in sleep. She maintained that connection. Something about the image arrested him. The dedication, the care, the way she'd given herself to this vigil without hesitation or negotiation. He must have made a sound. Claire stirred. Her eyes opened. She didn't startle or pull away from Thomas, just looked up at Victor with that quiet composure he was beginning to recognize. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "No." He stayed in the doorway. Safer there. You should rest. I can send someone to relieve you. I'm fine. She adjusted her grip on Thomas's hand. He sleeps better when someone's here. Victor believed her. He'd seen the difference her presence made. What he couldn't understand was why. Why do you care so much? The question escaped before he could stop it. He's not your child. You barely know him. Claire studied him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Thomas's sleeping face. My husband and I wanted children, she said quietly. Tried for years. It never happened. Then Daniel died in a mine collapse 3 years ago, 28 years old. Gone in an instant. Her voice stayed steady, but Victor heard the old grief beneath it. I had all this love stored up, she continued. All this care I'd prepared to give. Nowhere to put it. Nursing lets me share what I have. Some of us don't have gold to give. Mr. Caldwell, we give what we have. The simplicity of it stunned him. She'd suffered loss, been left with nothing but her capacity to care. And she'd turned that into her offering to the world. Victor had suffered loss too, but he'd responded by building walls, accumulating wealth, making himself untouchable through sheer financial power. What does Thomas need? He heard himself ask. Claire met his eyes. His father. Not his father's money. Him. I provide everything for him. You provide things. That's not the same as providing yourself. Victor wanted to argue, to list everything he'd given, the house, the education, the security, the future he'd guaranteed through hard work and smart investments. But standing in this doorway, watching his son sleep holding someone else's hand, the arguments felt hollow. I don't know how, he admitted. The words tasted like defeat. I don't know how to be what he needs. Claire's expression softened. Start by sitting beside him, not pacing outside, not sending telegrams. Just being present when he wakes. That's all. That's everything. Victor looked at his son. 10 years old, motherless, fevered, scared, and somehow Victor had convinced himself that money could fill all those holes. Will you... He stopped. Started again. Will you teach me... Claire smiled. Small, sad, understanding. Pull up that chair. Victor entered the room. Actually entered. He'd stood in the doorway 100 times these past days. But crossing the threshold felt different, like stepping into foreign territory. He pulled a chair beside the bed, sat awkwardly. His hands didn't know what to do. His body felt wrong. Everything about this felt unnatural. Claire reached over and guided his hand to Thomas's shoulder. Just rest it there. Let him know you're close. Victor's palm settled on his son's thin shoulder. He felt the fever heat, the fragile bones, the vulnerability of this child he'd protected with money but never with presence. Thomas stirred. His eyes opened slightly, fever-glazed but trying to focus. Papa. The word came out confused, uncertain, as if finding his father beside him made no sense. I'm here, son. Victor's throat closed around the words. You're really here. Yes. Thomas's eyes closed again, but his breathing changed. Some tension released. Okay, Papa. Then sleep took him again, but it was different this time. Peaceful. The kind of sleep that actually healed. Victor sat frozen. That one word Papa echoed in his mind. Thomas hadn't called him that in months, maybe longer. Somewhere in the blur of work and wealth accumulation, Victor had stopped being Papa and become Sir or Father or simply Mr. Caldwell. He looked across the bed at Claire. She was watching him with something like hope in her eyes. Stay, she said. Just stay here with him. So Victor stayed, through the remainder of the night, through dawn breaking cold over the mountains, Through his usual time for reviewing reports and checking production numbers, he stayed beside his son. And for the first time in years, Victor Caldwell stopped running from what scared him most, his own heart. 3 days later, Thomas's fever finally broke. The specialists examined him and declared the crisis past. They couldn't explain exactly why. Their treatments should have worked sooner. Some combination of factors. They said, body's natural healing, proper care, time. None of them mentioned Claire, or Victor finally learning to sit still. Thomas woke that afternoon with clear eyes. The first thing he did was look for Claire. "I'm here," she said from her chair. "You stayed," Thomas said wonderingly. "You stayed the whole time." "Of course I did." Thomas turned his head toward Victor. "Papa, too. Your father's been right here." Claire's voice carried warmth Victor hadn't earned. "He's barely left your side." It was generous. Victor had been present maybe half the time. The other half he'd spent in his study, hiding from feelings he didn't know how to process. But Claire gave him credit anyway. "Thank you, Papa," Thomas said quietly. Victor nodded. Words felt impossible. His son was alive, recovering. Looking at him without that wounded confusion that had marked their interactions for months, the specialists prepared to depart. They left detailed instructions and expensive medicines. Victor paid their exorbitant fees without comment. Money still flowed easily. It was everything else that felt hard when the house grew quiet again. Victor found Claire in the kitchen. She was preparing simple broth for Thomas. "I want to pay you more," he said. "Triple your wages. Permanent position here. You could supervise a whole medical staff if needed." Claire didn't even pause in her stirring. "No, thank you." "Name your price. Then, whatever you want." Now she looked at him. "That's your answer for everything. Isn't it money? Money solves problems. Does it?" She set down the spoon. "Did it break Thomas's fever? Did it make him ask for you? Did it teach you how to sit beside him?" Victor felt his jaw tighten. "The medicines I purchased helped, yes, but what healed him?" She met his eyes steadily. "You saw him worsen while the expensive doctors tried everything. You saw him calm when someone just held his hand. You're a smart man, Victor. What actually helped, he wanted to argue, to insist on the validity of his approach, to defend the fortune he'd spent and the experts he'd hired, but he'd watched it all fail. He'd seen money buy expertise that couldn't cure. He'd felt his son turn away from him despite everything he'd provided. What do you want? Then, the question came out more desperate than he intended. Claire's expression softened. I want you to understand what your son needs. And it's not something I can give him, or you can buy. Then what? That night, Thomas had nightmares. Not fever dreams this time. Real nightmares born from the fear he'd been carrying, losing his mother, almost losing his own life, being alone in a house full of people who worked for his father. Claire tried to comfort him, but Thomas kept crying, calling for someone who wasn't there. He needs you, Claire told Victor. He's asking for his papa. Victor came, stood in the doorway of his son's room. Thomas was sitting up in bed, crying, reaching out. Victor froze. This was what he'd feared. The raw need. The vulnerability. The chance to fail at something that mattered. Claire appeared beside him. She took his hand, guided him forward, placed his hand in his son's reaching fingers. Just hold him, she whispered. Tell him you're here. Victor's arms came up awkwardly. Thomas crashed into him, small body shaking with sobs. 10 years old, but feeling much younger, much more fragile. I've got you, Victor managed. Papa's here. I've got you. Son. Thomas clung to him desperately. All the tears he'd held back. All the fear. All the loneliness of the past 2 years since Elizabeth died and Victor retreated into work. And Victor held him, let him cry, didn't try to fix it or stop it or make it go away with money or promises, just held him. When Thomas finally quieted, Victor realized he was crying too. Tears he'd locked away when Elizabeth died, grief he'd buried under contracts and mining reports, fear that he'd already lost his son even while the boy still lived. "I'm sorry," Victor said hoarsely. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I've been gone. Even when I was here. I was gone. I just wanted you. Papa." Thomas's voice broke. "I didn't need all the other stuff. I just wanted you." The truth of it devastated him. All the wealth, all the empire building, all the provision. And his son had been starving for the one thing money couldn't buy: his father's presence. Claire stood in the doorway, watching, not smiling, not judging, just witnessing this moment that might finally change everything, or might not. Victor had lived so long behind his walls, breaking them down would take more than one night of tears. But it was a start. The first real step across the threshold he'd been afraid to cross. Thomas fell asleep in his arms. Victor held him long after, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing had formed between them. Outside, winter held on. But something inside this house had begun to thaw. Victor didn't go to his office the next morning, or the morning after that. For the first time in 15 years, mining reports waited while he stayed home. He sat with Thomas. At first it felt awkward. Victor didn't know what to say, how to just be without doing, how to exist in stillness instead of constant motion. Claire taught him. Read to him, she suggested. Not business correspondence, something he'd enjoy. So Victor read old frontier tales. Stories about cowboys and homesteaders and people who did right when doing right was hard. His voice stumbled over the unfamiliar rhythm, but Thomas listened, sometimes dozed, sometimes smiled. Just talk to him. Claire said another day. Tell him what you're thinking. That felt even harder. Victor wasn't used to sharing his thoughts, business decisions, yes, strategies, plans, but thoughts, feelings, the internal landscape he'd kept locked away. He tried anyway. Told Thomas about his own childhood, the fears, the loneliness, the way he'd learned to survive by needing no one. Your mama wanted me to be different, Victor admitted. She asked me before she died to give you what mattered most. Not money, not security, just me. Thomas watched him with Elizabeth's eyes. Why didn't you? I didn't know how. I only knew how to work. How to provide, how to build things. Victor's voice roughened. I was afraid of failing you the way I felt I failed her. You didn't fail Mama, Thomas said quietly. She told me that. She said you loved her so much it scared you. That's why you worked so hard. You were trying to save her. The words hit Victor like a blow. She said that right before she died. She said you loved me too. You just didn't know how to show it without buying things. Victor's vision blurred. Elizabeth had understood him, had seen past his walls to the fear beneath, and somehow she'd forgiven him for it. Had asked their son to forgive him too. Your mama was wiser than me, he said. She said you'd figure it out eventually. Thomas reached for his hand. She said sometimes the strongest people take longest to learn they don't have to be strong alone. Victor broke right there, sitting on his son's bed in the middle of the afternoon. Wept like he'd never let himself weep when Elizabeth died. Thomas held his hand. Let him cry. Didn't try to fix it. When Victor finally gathered himself, he found Claire in the kitchen. She was preparing supper. Simple food. Nothing fancy. Thank you, he said. For what? For staying. For teaching me. For caring about my son when I didn't know how to care for him myself. Claire turned from the stove, studied him with those steady eyes. You're learning. Victor, that's what matters. You're choosing to change. I don't know if I can be what he needs. You already are. You're here. You're trying. That's everything. Victor looked at this woman. Widow. Working class. Someone he'd dismissed as hired help when she first arrived. Now she was the one teaching him what actually mattered. Stay longer, he heard himself say. Not as a nurse. As... He didn't know how to finish. Thomas loves you. He couldn't say the rest. Not yet, but Claire's expression softened. I'll stay through winter, she said. Until spring. Until Thomas is fully strong again. Spring comes early in mining camps. Maybe March. Maybe March. Then, she returned to her cooking. Victor stood in the doorway watching her. Something had shifted. He saw her now, not as the employee, not as someone to pay and dismiss, as a woman. Remarkable. Strong in ways that had nothing to do with money or power. As someone who'd already given him more than any fortune could purchase. Outside. Late February arrived. Ice began cracking on the streams. Days grew incrementally longer. Winter still held the land. But its grip was loosening. Inside. Victor Caldwell learned to sit still. To listen. To be present. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than working claims in brutal cold. Harder than building an empire. Harder than anything he'd accomplished through will and wealth. But he kept trying, kept failing, kept learning. And slowly, something between him and Thomas began to heal. Something that had been broken since Elizabeth died. Since Victor had retreated behind his walls of money and efficiency, they read together. Built a simple birdhouse from scrap wood. Planted seeds in pots for the spring garden. Small things. Ordinary things. Things worth more than silver. Claire watched them both. Taught them both. Became something more than nurse or hired help. Became family. Though none of them had said it out loud yet. March arrived cold but promising. Thomas was running through the house again. Laughing. Healthy. His face had color. His eyes had light. He seemed younger somehow. Or maybe just finally like the child he should have been all along. Victor found himself watching his son with wonder, as if seeing him for the first time. This person he'd created. This life he'd almost lost. Not to fever. To his own stubborn blindness. The town had noticed changes too. Victor walked Main Street with Thomas now. Attended church. Spoke kindly to miners he'd once treated like numbers in a ledger. His superintendent commented that Mr. Caldwell seemed different. Softer. Somehow. But not weaker. Maybe stronger. One evening, Victor stood in the kitchen doorway. Claire was teaching Thomas to bake bread. Simple. Domestic. Nothing his wealth had purchased or his power had commanded. Thomas's hands worked the dough. Claire guided him gently. They were laughing about something. Some small joke between them. The kitchen smelled of yeast and warmth. Victor watched this ordinary moment. Realized it was worth more than all his silver claims, more than his mansion, more than the empire he'd spent 15 years building. This warmth, this connection, this life actually being lived instead of just survived. He understood now, completely, without doubt. Money had bought specialists who failed, medicines that didn't cure. It had employed Claire, but couldn't create her compassion. Couldn't buy her gentle hands or patient presence, couldn't purchase her freely given love. Thomas had recovered not from expensive treatment, but from love. Claire's yes, but also Victor's slowly learned presence, his willingness to sit still, to be vulnerable, to let himself need and be needed. That night, after Thomas went to bed, Victor found Claire in the parlor. She was mending her dress again. Same dress she'd arrived in months ago, worn but clean, dignified despite its poverty. Claire? He said her name carefully. Can we talk? She set down her sewing. Of course. Victor sat. Words felt inadequate. But he'd learned that inadequate was better than absent. You saved my son's life, he began. The fever broke on its own. Not his body, his heart. Victor met her eyes. You saved both of us. Me and Thomas. You showed me what actually matters when I was blind to everything but money. Claire shook her head gently. You did the hard work, Victor. You chose to change, to learn, to break down the walls you'd built. Because you showed me how. Because you were patient. Because you cared. He leaned forward. I've spent 15 years believing money solved problems. That wealth meant power. That provision equaled love. And now I know better. Money bought expertise that failed. Medicines that didn't work. It paid you to be here, but it couldn't create what you gave freely. He paused. Gathered courage. What you're still giving. To Thomas. To me. Claire waited. Not pushing. Just present. I've come to care for you. Victor said. The words felt clumsy, insufficient. Not as Thomas's nurse, as the woman who taught me life's real currency, who showed me strength comes in gentle hands, who kept me human when I was turning into something else entirely. He stood, paced, old habits dying hard. Thomas needs a mother. I know that. Someone who can give him the love and patience I'm still learning. He turned back to her. But I need you too, as a partner, as someone who will keep challenging me, keep teaching me, keep reminding me what actually matters. Victor knelt beside her chair, met her eyes level. Claire Morrison, will you marry me? Will you stay not just through spring, but always? Will you make this house a home, and this man into someone worthy of the life you've helped me? Find silence filled the parlor, clock ticking on the mantel, wind outside in the pines. Victor's heart hammering. Claire's eyes had filled with tears. But she didn't answer. Not right away. You need to be sure, she said finally. Not grateful, not desperate. Sure. I'm sure. Victor took her hand. I'm sure that watching you teach Thomas to bake bread matters more than any mining report. I'm sure that your wisdom is worth more than all the experts I hired. I'm sure that I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you how to actually live, not just survive, not just accumulate, live. Claire studied him, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for the old Victor hiding beneath the new. Thomas needs to agree, she said softly. I already asked him. Victor smiled, small. Real. He said if I didn't propose soon, he was going to. That broke her. Laughter and tears together. She touched his face, her work-worn hand against his skin. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, Victor, I'll marry you. Victor pulled her close, held her. This woman who'd entered his house as hired help and become everything that actually mattered. Outside, winter's last storm built in the mountains, but inside. Warmth had finally won. Light had finally broken through. A man who'd believed money fixed everything had learned better. A woman who'd lost everything had found family. A boy had gotten both parents back. Spring was coming. And with it, new life, new hope, new beginning. Claire didn't announce the engagement immediately. She made Victor wait. Consider. Be sure. One final lesson about things that couldn't be rushed or bought. 3 days later, she told him yes again, this time in front of Thomas. The boy cheered and hugged them both. For the first time since Elizabeth died. The house felt full. They married on the first day of April. Spring had finally arrived. Crocuses pushed through melting snow. The sky held promise instead of threat. The whole town came, packed the little church. Victor's business associates looked shocked. The Silver King marrying a widow nurse. Someone without fortune or position. Someone who'd worked in their households as hired help. Victor didn't care what they thought. Not anymore. Thomas stood beside him as best man, beaming, healthy, happy. Everything Victor had wanted for his son but hadn't known how to provide. Claire walked down the aisle in a new dress. Simple. Blue. The only thing Victor had convinced her to let him buy. She'd refused everything else. No fancy wedding. No expensive reception. Just a ceremony and a celebration. Just family. Just love. Just what mattered. When Victor slipped the ring on her finger, his hands shook. Not from fear. From gratitude. That somehow he'd been given a second chance. That Claire had seen past his arrogance to the lost man beneath. They settled into new rhythms. Claire ran the household not as servant but as partner. Victor still managed his mines but left the office by supper. Came home to family instead of hiding in work. Thomas thrived. He had a mother again. Not a replacement for Elizabeth. Never that. But someone who loved him. Who read to him. Who taught him compassion alongside Victor's lessons in strength. Victor established a fund for minors, widows, and orphans. Remembering Claire's late husband. Remembering all the people his single-minded ambition had overlooked. The fund grew. He built a small hospital. Made sure working families could access care regardless of ability to pay. His wealth finally served purposes beyond accumulation, beyond power, beyond the hollow security he'd once thought mattered most. One evening in late spring, the three of them sat together in the parlor. Claire was reading. Thomas was drawing. Victor was watching them with a contentment he'd never imagined possible. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, pacing cold hallways at 3 a.m, throwing money at problems, isolated in his own house despite filling it with expensive things. That man had been rich, but so very poor. Papa! Thomas looked up from his drawing. Can we plant the garden tomorrow? If your mama says yes. Mama came naturally now. Claire had earned the title. Thomas had given it freely. Some families were born. Some were built from broken pieces and second chances. Garden sounds perfect, Claire said. She reached for Victor's hand, squeezed gently. Thomas showed them his drawing. A family of 3, standing together, smiling, simple and true. I made this for you and Mama, he said. To remember. Remember what, son? Victor asked. That we found each other. Even when everything seemed bad, we found each other? Victor took the drawing, studied it. This child's vision of what they'd become, what they were still becoming. Your Mama Elizabeth would be proud, he said softly. She asked me to learn this, to be present. To love you not with money but with myself. She knows, Thomas said with child's certainty. She's watching, and she's happy. Maybe he was right. Victor wanted to believe it. That Elizabeth saw them now, saw him finally learning what she'd tried to teach, saw their son healed and happy, saw Claire loving them both. Outside. Full spring had arrived. Windows stood open to warm air. Light poured through rooms that had once felt shadowed and cold. The mansion hadn't changed, but it had become a home. Victor pulled Claire close, ruffled Thomas's hair, held these two people who meant more than his empire, more than his fortune, more than anything he'd accumulated in 15 years of relentless work. The townspeople talked about it for years, how the Silver King married hired help, how their love taught everyone a lesson. Some wealth couldn't be bought, only given freely and received with humble gratitude. Victor Caldwell had spent a fortune trying to fix everything with money, had learned the hard way that some things, most things couldn't be purchased. Presence, love, family, the warmth of ordinary moments, the joy of simply being together. These were treasures beyond price. And he'd found them only when he stopped trying to buy his way to happiness. Spring deepened into summer. The garden grew. Thomas ran wild in ways healthy children should. Claire filled the house with gentleness and strength. Victor learned daily to lay down his pride and pick up what truly mattered. He still ran his mines, still managed his wealth, but they no longer defined him. He was Thomas's father now, Claire's husband. A man learning slowly to measure worth in love instead of gold. And every night, when he closed his eyes, he was grateful for the illness that had brought Claire, for the crisis that had cracked his certainty, for the lessons learned through suffering and surrender. The richest man in the territory had finally discovered his greatest fortune. And it had nothing to do with silver. It had everything to do with the two people sleeping peacefully down the hall. His family, his home, his heart. Finally learning to beat outside his chest. Money had taught him what it could buy. Love had taught him everything else. And in the end, everything else was everything that mattered.